Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to have you all here for this wonderful evening, wonderful discussion. We're going to discuss Professor Hamid Dabashi's new book, fresh from the press, The Last Muslim Intellectual, The Life and Legacy of Jalal Al-e Ahmad. And the book is so new that usually I would hold the book and present it, but at the moment I only have the copy printed because it wasn't sent as of yet, but we are very happy to have this opportunity to discuss this new and wonderful and rich publication. I wanted to just say a few words in terms of introduction, introducing myself, Gil Hochberg. I'm chair of MISAS, Department of Middle East, South Asian and African Studies here at Columbia University. It's an honor to introduce to you a book by Hamid Dabashi, my dear colleague and the director of our undergraduate program at MISAS. The book I will let others talk about and introduce because they have prepared more, but I will just, if I may, before introducing the speakers, read just a couple of lines that grabbed my attention, and I just wanted to have them sound out before we start. These are really just sort of picks from across the book. Ali Ahmad was the last organic Muslim intellectual, rooted in layers of Muslim learning and yet openly defiant of all of them at the same time. Just to tease your interest. Another sentence: to think towards a post-Islamic liberation theology, we need to think back over the very recent history when Islam and Muslims were in active conversation with non-Islamic facts, phenomena, and forces of their world and worldliness. And a part that really grabbed my attention, and I highlighted it many times, I am reading now. I make a categorical distinction between two terms, Islamic and Islamist. Islamic liberation theology is deeply rooted in Islamic intellectual traditions, but is widely conversant with the world. Islamism, on the other hand, is a product of the Muslim encounter with European colonialism and has actively cannibalized Muslim intellectual traditions for the sake of a triumphant encounter with the West. For this reason, I equate Islamism with Zionism and regard them, in fact, though both evidently at odds with each other, as identical ideological product of European colonialism. For me, this is, of course, just part of what this wonderful book that is really a rich intellectual biography of Jalal Al-e Ahmad. This was just to highlight some of the explosive, rich intellectual material that you will find here that far exceed our common understanding of what an intellectual biography might mean. So I wanted to share that. And now I will go ahead and introduce our author and our speakers. Professor Hamid Dabashi really needs little introduction, but I will introduce him nevertheless. He is the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He is the author of numerous books. I will just mention a few: Authority in Islam, Theology and Discontent, Truth and Narrative, Close-Up Iranian Cinema, Past, Present and Future, Staging a Revolution, Masters and Masterpieces in Iranian Cinema, A People Interrupted, and many more. Ali Mirzerpasi is an Albert Gallian research excellent professor of Middle East and Islamic Studies at New York University. He is also the director of the Hagop Kivorian Center of Near Eastern Studies at New York University and the director of Iranian Studies Initiative at NYU. He's the author of numerous books as well, including Iran's Quiet Revolution, The Downfall of the Pahlavi State, Iran's Troubled Modernity, Debating Ahmad Faradid's Legacy, and Transnationalism in Iranian Political Thought, The Life and Thought of Ahmad Faradid. Second in the order of speakers is Eleni Sentim-Zeleki, who is an assistant professor in my department as well, and Hamid Dabashi's Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies here at Columbia University. She is the author of Ethiopia in Theory, Revolution and Knowledge Production, 1964 to 2016, among other published works. Last but not least, Atafe Akbari is a term assistant professor of English at Barnard College, and her current book project is a cross-cultural comparison of Iranian and Caribbean fiction and poetry from 1960 to 1980s. There is an article from this project that is already published called Where is the Friend's Home? New World Landscapes in Sohab Safari's Poetic Geography. I welcome all of our great speakers and our author, Hamid Dabashi, my colleagues, and new colleagues from sister institutions, and we will go right ahead. We will start with Professor Dabashi's few words of introduction, followed by commentary, followed after by Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I first had to unmute myself. Thank you, Gil. Let me begin by thanking Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, its executive director, my old colleague and friend, Eileen Gululi, and Kelly McKinney, the associate director, for kindly hosting this event, initiating this event. I'm very grateful to them, as well as the Office of Divisional Deans in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences who are co-sponsoring this event, and of course my own department, MISAS. And my distinguished colleague and chair of my department, Gil Hochberg, who has been chairing our department despite difficulties. We are not an easy department to chair, but Gil does it with such grace and patience, for which we are all grateful. I thank also my friends, my colleagues who have spent time from their own, taking time from their own work and reading my book, this new book. As all of you know, writing is a very solitary event. We just sit down. In my case, I get up very early in the morning and start writing. So a public event like this for me is a particularly joyous event. I'm very grateful. I'm happy to see my friends. It's a social, celebratory event. Ali Mirsepasi I have known forever, his dear friend. His project and my project have been dovetailing over the last 30 years. I'm a great admirer of his work. He is a pillar of Iranian studies. And as he knows, I always say that once I had an option of going to NYU or Columbia, and I think my better self went to NYU, and my troublemaking self came to Columbia. I'm extremely grateful to my colleague Eleni, Professor Zeleki, for taking time for her work. I'm particularly delighted that she accepted to come and be an interlocutor in this project. I'm a great admirer of Eleni's work, Ethiopia in Theory, which I have been reading and benefiting from, is an utterly extraordinary intervention, which I highly recommend. And then Atafe Akbari, whom I have the pleasure of knowing for years, great admirer of her work, recent doctoral dissertation from Columbia, and her position as a professor of English literature in our sister college, Barnard. So first and foremost, I really am happy to be here And whatever it is that I wanted to say about the book or about Al-Ahmad, I have written it. And I have run out of. This is the second time that, as some of you may know, that I've had an encounter with Al-Ahmad. This time around, about 40 years after the revolution, more than anything else, there were two factors that drew me back to Al-Ahmad. First and foremost, I missed reading him. Reading him reminded me of my undergraduate years in Tehran of late 60s, early 70s. Ali and I are almost the same age, so we have similar reminiscences of Tehran. As both of us as provincial boys coming to this magnificent capital and so forth. So I miss reading Al-Ahmad, especially his essays. So I began rereading him out loud to myself, and before I knew it, I was starting taking notes and writing. The second aspect is really autobiographical, that it is an autobiographical stage of my writing. I recently published a book on Edward Said, who was the Al-Ahmad of United States, and Al-Ahmad was Edward Said of Iran. So in my mind, I was bringing them together. More substantively, so far as the argument of the book is concerned, is very much indebted to my distinguished friend Asif Bayat's idea of post-Islamism, a term that he coined and has been very provocative and fruitful point of conversation. And it captures, the book is intended to capture a moment, early 20th century up to mid 20th century. Al-Ahmad did not live a long life. He died very young in late 40s. But it had a rich, fulfilling, provocative, flamboyant life. And one of the key chapters that preoccupied me for a long time was the chapter on his relationship with his wife, the towering literary figure, Simin Daneshvar, which is the subject of Professor Akbari's scholarship. And as I began to write that chapter, 4 magnificent volumes of their correspondences had just been published, and I just was flabbergasted sitting and reading these 4 volumes. About 3 volumes of the 4 volumes I bought Al-Ahmad to Simin Daneshvar when she had a fellowship at the Stanford. And reading those volumes and engaging in the relationship, which was very intimate, very troubling at the same time, etc. And also the fact that their troublesome relationship pivoted when they both were invited to go to Israel. And Al-Ahmad wrote his travelogue, the first part of his travelogue to Israel, before 67, and then the second part was published after 67. So it is a book that is a mixture of, I never sit down to write a book without extensive reading. I'm a reader, I'm not just a writer. I write about things that I read. And but then certain new ideas, for example, the chapter that I was writing on him and his wife, the Bakhtin, became very important in detecting a feminine voice in Al-Ahmad, which I had never thought. And then, of course, in his essays, Shklovsky's formalism became paramount in my reading of his prose. So what I hope, in fact, the couple of passages that Gil picked up are sort of tip of the iceberg of my excitement of going back to Al-Ahmad and encountering him and reading him and engaging with him, but with the sensibilities of somebody now in 2020, 2021, as I was writing, and all of the issues that concerns and preoccupies us. I leave the rest for my colleagues to reflect on. I really don't want to take too much time. The book is fairly self-explanatory, and ideas of it could be provocative, as Gil just said, in provoking your own thoughts, your own ideas about the issues. But first and foremost, I wanted to place Al-Ahmad next to his contemporaries outside Iran. I went to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, to look at people like Césaire, like others, Fanon, like all the way to Latin American figures, Jose Marti, etc. In order to map out a different configuration of what it means to be a Muslim intellectual. And then it has, of course, this provocative title that entices you, hopefully, to get to read the book as to what I mean by the last Muslim intellectual. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Hamid. And let's now just go in the order of our presentation. I won't interrupt each time, so we'll just start with Ali Mirzapasi, and then we will move on to the following two speakers.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Hochberg and Hamid John and everyone who have organized and certainly for inviting me to join this wonderful event. Since we are short of time, I'm going to read what I have written, and but I would like to ask you to bear with me, because as I read, I probably need to summarize some of my arguments. And I need you to bear with me. I will make several arguments and basically share with you my reflections from a particular reading of the book. This is a very rich book, and I can write several different reviews or reflections on the book. But since we are short of time, I just decided to be a little biased and just give a particular reading of the book. This doesn't exclude other wonderful aspects of this book, but I just felt that if I want to address everything that I feel are important and remarkable about this book, I will end up with a boring list, which I don't want to do. And at the end, I want to ask Professor Dabashi a question or maybe an idea to reflect on. I hope it works within the time limit. First of all, I see this book as part of Professor Dabashi's remarkable work on Iranian cosmopolitanism that he has published at least in the past 2 decades or more, and I'm aware of. These series of books by Hamid Dabashi has expanded the boundaries of academic discussions of Iranian history and culture in a wonderful interdisciplinary way. In these books, Dabashi draws our attention from the worldliness of the life and thought of Iranian literary figures, including classical literary figures, travelers, and now with this book, a contemporary intellectual, Jalal Al-e Ahmad, as we are all aware of. In my view, Dabashi's scholarship, certainly in the past 20 years or so, engages in the process that I would like to call the discovery of Iran, borrowing from Nehru's wonderful book. I think this is the unifying theme of these books. That is for Dabashi to tell its readers that one can be an Iranian and a Muslim person openly and publicly, because it is increasingly difficult to do that, and also a man or woman of this world. I think this is, if I want to summarize this book, this is what this book is all about. But this is also true of many of the previous books, unfortunately, that we don't have time to go into that. In other words, what comes out of Hamid's scholarship is a statement like this, that a human condition, that is what he's studying, where one is both at home and also in the world. To just borrow from another great Indian writer, Tagore, this is the title of his novel on Indian nationalism. In this particular book, by the way, which is elegantly written, Dabashi, again, in my view, is fascinated with Jalal Ahmad's world and time. This is what I want to highlight. The book, therefore, can be thought of as a narrative on how to remember the last time or the past century. And in this context, at least for me, this book reminds me of another book that I feel is a wonderful, wonderful read, and that is Tony Judd's book, Reflections on the Forgotten 20th Century. The late Tony Judd warns us of the grave risk of misremembering the lessons of 20th century Iranian politics, of intellectual politics, as an age of political extremes, of tragic mistakes and mistaken choices. Of course, he's talking about European history. He also reminds us that the reckless misunderstanding of the past may make us think of our time as the end of the history of delusions and to the mistaken conclusion that we have liberated ourselves from those mistakes and emerge victorious. In other words, it not only misremembers the past, but it gives a mistaken view of the present. I will now move on to how Dabashi situate our time and the past or lost time. Dabashi's account, of course, is more blatant and more direct. In this book, The Last Muslim Intellectual makes a similar argument, to quote him. After the Iranian Revolution of 1977-79 came the devastating Iran-Iraq War of the 80s, then the two successive US invasions of Iraq in the 90s and 2000, the Afghanistan invasion in 2001, the Green Movement of 2008 to 10 in Iran, and then the Arab Spring of 2010 to 12, then the rise of criminal gangs of ISIL, followed by mayhem in Syria and the Saudi genocide in Yemen. Now, to make his case on how to remember, Dabashi suggests Dabashi's suggestion is Dabashi reminds us a particular misremembering of the past by posing this question, quote, in what sense have we lost the world of Jalal Ahmad? He reminds us the unique quality of Jalal Ahmad, to describe the intellectual period. He was a pioneering literary experimentations depicting the suffering of the everyday Tehranis under the autocratic Pahlavi modernizations. He gives ample examples, and I wish I had time to go through them, but I just gave a couple of examples to give you a flavor of, for those of you who haven't read the book. The old men sitting by the dusty roadside baking under the sun while trying desperately to sell worthless goods during Ramadan so that his family might survive. Or little girls asleep on the rooftop of tenement buildings to escape the heat of crowded one-room homes, wondering what does the Pahlavi modernization brings to them. Those of us, certainly in this case, in terms of age and generations, Hamid and I, those of us marked by these stories should never forget that Al-Ahmad was an impassioned witness to the suffering of everyday Iranians under dictatorship and poverty as the process we now call modernization was going on. Now, can we forget how Al-Ahmad drew his literary inspiration not merely from Iranian traditions, but European existentialism, Camus, Ionesco's, Sartre's, and many others, while taking an interest in the fate of human communities worldwide. When Dabashi invokes a lost world, it is this milieu of profound suffering, but also radiant hope that comes to mind. At least that is what comes to your mind if you read this book. Is there such a hope? This is the question that I think it's an enlightening question that he poses. Is there such a hope among intellectuals and activists today? If not, where has it gone and why? Dabashi's own reflections in answering, or at least entertaining this question, is the following. By returning to Al-Ahmad, I want to come forward to this moment we now live and make some sense of it via the configuration of a towering figure I could here submit as the last Muslim intellectual of now an entirely bygone age. To conclude, Dabashi seems to conclude that claims by Muslims to worldliness today have been shattered by an appalling history spreading across the decades following Al-Ahmad's death. Yet, in Al-Ahmad's time, such a worldly claim remained still conceivable. This is the best, in a very concise and brief way, I can give image of what Hamid describes in the book. Now, follow up to Hamid's own reflections, I want to reflect and ask a question. And that is that, Hamid John, in your book, I hope you agree with me that at times you minimize, and perhaps to some extent, you explain away the troubling side of Al-Ahmad's life and thoughts. You actually say that openly in the book. More specifically, you overlook Al-Ahmad's political disillusionments and existential identity crisis which led to Al-Ahmad become a militant warrior against Iranian cosmopolitanism, the whole idea that you're advocating for. An example would be deciding with anti-Mashrute cleric Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, and also developing a hostile attitude toward overall what we may want to call cosmopolitan intellectuals of the time. You do mention this in the book, by the way. I'm not giving you more information, but you try to explain this away. Here is my question. I wonder if the very things that you dismiss as trivial may be the most valuable, or at least somehow valuable, for explaining the rise of malevolently fanciful and autocratic populisms that you critique and we saw almost everywhere today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ali, and we are going to move to Eleni.
All right. I can begin. You don't have to introduce me or anything like that, since you already have. Hamid, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today about your book. I think that the best way for me to approach my remarks is to connect Iran to Ethiopia. And I think that I read your book through Ethiopia. And I think one of the reasons why I did that is because as a child, I did experience the Iranian Revolution as sharing something in common with the Ethiopian Revolution, in so much as they were both these sort of odd third world revolutions that happened in the 1970s, and that in some ways were unthinkable from the point of view of Western political thought. And it strikes me that if the history of revolution is often written as a kind of telos that begins, in France in 1789, both the Iranian and Ethiopian revolution kind of mark this moment when revolution is no longer part of a story of affirmative possibility. And so I've always been interested in thinking the Iranian and Ethiopian revolution together, although I can't say I've done any formal study towards this project, but let me try today to make some other connections. And one of the things that has always struck me about Iran and Ethiopia is the ways in which both Haile Selassie, the Haile Selassie regime, and the Shah projected their regimes as representing some kind of anti-colonial sovereignty. But that sovereignty also being rooted in a kind of ancient past. And so from my own research on the period just before the 1974 revolution in Ethiopia, and from my vague understanding of the Iranian revolution, I think what the Haile Selassie regime and what the Shah represent is not something really rooted in ancient past, but actually the further institutionalization of a colonial modernity. And this has led me to understand the immediate period just before each of these revolutions as a period where, as you say, the infrastructure of institutionalizing this colonial modernity was actually being set up, so that the anti-colonial nation state actually remains saturated within the logics of colonial modernity. And in the context of Ethiopia, I think what becomes interesting is the ways in which Coptic Christianity and the Amharic language become pillars in terms of building this modern nation state project. So that in effect actually makes the Ethiopian nation state both a religiously and ethnically exclusive project rooted in the Amharic language. And although I don't know enough about Iran, I am curious how this process played out there. I'm interested in ways in which we can think about sort of the Persian identity as a racialized identity. In the modern sense of racialized, and who was included and who was excluded when certain cultural practices that might have had a long history of flexibility were repositioned within that nation state project. In particular, what happens to the complexity of local cultural practices when they become part of a modern state project, and what kinds of new resentments and new hostilities are created And how did that become part of the history of sectarianism that we live with in these societies today? And so, of course, the reason I'm raising these questions is because I'm wondering how we read your portrait of Jalal Al-e Ahmad in light of this complex history. And what is interesting for me in your portrait of Jalal Al-e Ahmad is that you end up framing him as somebody who comes from a traditional religious family, but you also tell us that he is well-read and well-traveled, and you're careful to draw out the ways in which he's part of a larger cosmopolitan world that is multilingual and conversant with various philosophical and literary traditions. And what becomes even more fascinating is that you say that he doesn't have a fixed identity, but an identity that is contingent on encounters with others in the world. And in fact, you then go on to define being Muslim as actually that which is about having these contingent encounters with others in the world. And in a sense, then you are able to define an Islamist is as something in opposition to this contingent experience, in so much as the Islamist is interested in an encounter with Western colonialism, but he's rewriting the history of Islam as a kind of triumphalist encounter with the West, right? And of course, that triumphalist encounter eclipses that dialogical quality that you say is sort of important to Islam. And so it seems to me that part of your project is to rescue Jalal Al-e Ahmad from this totalizing view. And you do this by showing us the ways in which he was preoccupied with worldly questions and not just nativist questions. In particular, you want to emphasize that he must be read alongside other anti-colonial world makers such as Senghor, Césaire, and Fanon. And in that sense, it seems to me that what you want to argue is that lamenting the victories of the West or denouncing the victories of the West does not have to be associated merely with the clerics of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So part of what I think you're arguing here is that Jalal Al-e Ahmad was producing not just nativist thought, but was producing kind of an alternative global modernity, or trying to imagine some kind of alternative global modernity. And I see part of your argument then connecting with current work about sort of the Black Atlantic and Black anti-colonial world making, particularly Adom Getacheo's book, World Making After Empire, where she does look at a generation of Black anti-colonial nationalists and the ways in which they try to imagine the world after the fall of European empire and what that world might look like. But at the same time, there is a sense of failure of this decolonial vision in your work, in this portrait that you give us. After all, you are documenting the failure of Jalal Al-e Ahmad to fully articulate what this alternative project might look like. But there is also a sense of failure since, as you say, he is the last Muslim that is capable of a world-making project. So I guess part of my line of inquiry is, what does it mean to resuscitate the legacy of somebody like Jalal Al-e Ahmad for our period today? And what does it mean to bring back this type of anti-colonial world making today? More pointedly, I would ask, can his legacy be so cleanly disconnected from the overall counter-revolution against decolonization? So let me flesh this out just a little bit more and connect it back to Ethiopia. So if part of your argument is that colonial modernity is in a place like Iran or Ethiopia has manufactured sectarian tensions, I want to know, in what ways is cosmopolitan worldliness part of that colonial modernity, or how it, is it not part of that history as well? I'm asking this question because Jalal Al-e Ahmad reminds me of a group of Ethiopian intellectuals associated with a newspaper called Birhane Salam, or Light and Peace. That was the name of the newspaper. And these intellectuals were extremely well-traveled. They spoke multiple languages, they traveled, and they were constantly seeking out new information about the modern world. At the same time, they were also very much the children of the infrastructure of colonial modernity established by Haile Selassie's regime. They were, for the most part, Coptic Christian, and there was a certain sense of what it meant to be elegant and learned amongst these group of people that I think was also exclusionary to a large degree, even if their work had this attractive cosmopolitan feeling to it. More recently, within Ethiopian studies, there's been a turn towards researching these intellectuals as offering a vision of an alternative modernity. But I'm not fully convinced by this as a move, since I think that ultimately what their lives tell us more about is the infrastructure of colonial modernity than anything to do with an alternative modernity. So that rather than actually finding ways out of the binaries that are the outcome of this colonial modernity, their lives might be foundational to the cementing of the sectarian binaries that shape our reality today. So I'm really curious if you can actually tell us more about how you understand your book as an intervention that is in some ways an attempt to overcome the kinds of sectarian binaries that shape a place like Iran or Ethiopia today. Yeah, and if you could just be more clear about what that intervention is specifically. So thank you again for your book, and thank you also for allowing me to comment.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really genuinely honored and grateful for being here in such great company. I agree with my colleagues that you've already mentioned this is such a rich book that due to time constraints, I have to have a very targeted reading that speaks to my discipline of English and comparative literary studies, as well as my personal history and that of my generation that is implicated in this book. I'd like to start my remarks with an excerpt from The Last Muslim Intellectual's Introduction. This is on page 4. Quote, "There is a paradoxical blessing to be found in reading Jalal Al-e Ahmad in his own healthy and robust Persian, and writing of him in a liberated and expansive English. This linguistic dissonance opens up liberating horizons for a healthy dose of critical thinking that disallows undue parental deference." End quote. This disallowing of undue parental deference through linguistic dissonance stuck with me throughout my reading of this book, as it encapsulated my own experience of reading and responding to it, and most importantly, learning from it. A seemingly innocuous question has been occupying my mind from the moment I received the invitation to speak on this panel. How will I refer to the writer of this book, whom you all know as Professor Hamid Dabashi, in a public academic setting at an elite institution of higher education in North America? How do I make the contours of my personal and professional relationship with him fit into this world? Upon arriving at the book's conclusion and reading about the crisis of the post-colonial subject, I understood that in grappling with this question, a symptom of this crisis was manifesting itself. And unsurprisingly, his book provided me with an answer. I don't have to make the contours of that relationship fit into this world. Instead, following his analysis of Jalal Al-e Ahmad's prose in the chapter titled Literary Interludes, I will forge my own contrapuntal language in the vein of Jalal Ahmad and refer to this writer as I always do, Aghay Dabashi. To me, he has always been and will always be Aghay Dabashi, even as our relationship has ostensibly transformed from mentor-mentee, from teacher-student to colleagues. For our non-Persian speaking audience members, Agha means man. When used as a prefix, it means Mr. But for me, a translation of Aghay Dabashi is not Mr. Dabashi. My father and his siblings used to refer to his late father, my grandfather, as Agha. They still do. In this vein, it becomes a term that denotes both reverence and intimacy. I have always also refrained from referring to him as Ustad, which means professor, the most common denomination used by Iranian students, or Aghay Doktor, literally Mr. Doctor, which is what academic colleagues say in reference to one another in public settings. So using his own critical methodologies and modes of analysis, it is thus within this framework of explaining why Aghay Dabashi is not Mr. Dabashi, but Aghay Dabashi to me, that I can demonstrate the centrality and versatility of his masterful endeavor, both for my own practices of comparative literary studies, translation, and pedagogy, and for literary studies writ large. As a post-colonial subject implicated in the Last Muslim Intellectual's conclusion, and as a member of the generation born in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, I am of a generation for whom, quote, the Islamist takeover had categorically distorted the very texture and disposition of the Iranian moral imagination and political thinking, end quote. This is from Aghay Dabashi's first chapter titled Remembrance of Things Past. On the same page, Ali Dabashi explains that, quote, I have neither nostalgic urges nor teleological reasons for returning to Al-Ahmad. Some 40 years of scholarship after the Iranian Revolution, my concern is the futurity of that past that now needs a historical retrieval, end quote. Through his meticulous retrieval, he has offered a roadmap for what possibilities a post-Islamist liberation theology contains for my generation and how we should revisit Jalal Al-e worldly prose in order to disabuse ourselves from the epistemic violence we were subjected to as a result of opportunistic renderings of his prose by his zealous admirers and critics alike. I knew the term Gharbzadeh, or was toxicated, before I knew who Al-Ahmad was. I'd heard it in school assemblies when we were cautioned against the evils of consuming Western culture and adopting their values. And I'd also occasionally hear it from friends, somewhat playfully mocking my Gharbzadegi for listening to, let's say, Michael Jackson instead of an Iranian pop singer. It was decades later, as a PhD student in English and comparative literature at Columbia University, when I would read the text in its entirety, first in Persian, and then in English translation for the first time. In his chapter titled Traveling in and Out of a Homeland, Ali Dabashi provides us with an example of how a critical engagement with the aforementioned linguistic dissonance offers an opportunity to read Al-Ahmad's travel narratives and the history of those travels apace with Freud. After offering in-depth analysis of the meanings and etymologies of the two terms safar and hazar in Persian, he writes, in the two term, quotation, this is a quotation, direct quotation from the book. In the two terms safar and hazar, we hear the echoes of the two Freudian ideas of the unheimlich and heimlich, unhomely and homely, strange and familiar, uncanny and common. In this example, a robust practice of comparative literary studies is on view, one that critically examines language and establishes constructive theoretical connections between different traditions through careful translation. This connection is constructed co-equally and organically in a manner that reflects Ali Dabashi's own claims about Al-Ahmad's worldliness. It is in this spirit that he lauds Ajay Singh Chaudhry's comparative reading of Al-Ahmad and Walter Benjamin's historiographies, through Karl Marx and his history of alienation, and to which Ali Dabashi adds a third figure, W.E.B. Du Bois, inviting us to, quote, read all their respective takes on the crucial gesture of estrangement, of defamiliarization, end quote. At the same time, Ali Dabashi is quick to point out the Eurocentricity of critical theory, capital C, capital T. But rather than, as he puts it, dispensing with the canon, we must put it into conversation with the post-colonial world, and in this case in particular with Al-Ahmad as a, quote, key Muslim voice now added to its canon, end quote, and thus develop what he calls a transcontinental critical theory. Embedded within this framework for critical theory is a model for literary criticism predicated on intimate local knowledges. So in chapter 4, titled The Master Essayist, Ali Dabashi writes about how Al-Ahmad's essays on the work of two foundational Iranian writers, Sadiq Hidayat and Nima Yushij, laid the groundwork for literary criticism in the country. He explains that Fatemeh Sayyah, Al-Ahmad's contemporary and the first professor of comparative literature at Tehran University, which incidentally is where I received both my bachelor's and master's degrees in English language and literature. He explains that she had a, quote, solid command over Russian and French literatures. And for her, literary theory meant for the contemporary Persian literature to hurry up and catch up with civilized Europeans, end quote. Writing about Al-Ahmad's critical position that he describes as the, quote unquote, precise opposite of hers, he points to the required, quote unquote, critical intimacy vis-a-vis the two writers that Al-Ahmad embodied. To conclude, it is within the model of Al-Ahmad's prose, his contrapuntal language, and his critical intimacy with these writers that Ali Dabashi has outlined for us, drawing from his own expansive historical, critical, and literary readings, that I've been able to locate models for my own comparative literary reading, writing, and teaching practices. When it comes to this reader, Ali Dabashi delivers on his promise of a liberatory project of reading. In The Last Muslim Intellectual, I see dynamic examples of both how to read Al-Ahmad's work as theory and how to theorize from within that reading experience in a language that speaks to and captures my experience as an Iranian Muslim post-colonial subject. The linguistic dissonance I experienced was not always liberatory. It started with a bilingual childhood, moved into a Persian-centric, anti-Western primary school education, and an Anglophone Eurocentric college education. It took a move to Columbia University, the same place where Agha Dabashi came into his own academic and intellectual self-consciousness, for me to arrive at a place where my linguistic dissonance would start to be liberating. I haven't fully arrived yet. I'm working on it. And Agha Dabashi is gently guiding me. After all, parental deference, insofar as it is not undue, is something to be revered. Thank you.
Well, thank you for our author and for these three magnificent presentations that were very, very rich, and also rich in how different aspects of the work they brought up. I would like to invite Professor Dabashi to address some of the points that were brought up in these, and then perhaps our speakers can join in a semi-free organic conversation before we open up in the last section of this for Q&A.
I just wish I could just sit here and listen to my three distinguished colleagues just talk. It's such a pleasure to hear them. I hope, I don't know if our audience who are sitting there patiently know that my colleagues, Ali Mirsapasi, Eleni Zalaki, and Atif Akbari are reflecting on this book from the heart and chest and the inner sanctum of their own scholarship, each one of them from their own scholarship. And it is such a divinely satisfying experience for me to hear that they are not just reflecting on something that I wrote, but actually they are bringing my reflections into the bosom of their own scholarship. Ali knows that I'm a great admirer of his work. In fact, recently, people in the critical world have begun to notice the similarities of his work and my work and our writing on both of us in coming from two different directions, but to the same destination. Ali is, of course, absolutely correct that the troubling side of Al-Ahmad, his populism, as he correctly puts it, and as I detect, was integral to it. And in fact, in my first reflection on Al-Ahmad, in my book on theology of discontent, I begin to tease out those aspects that then other ideologues pick up and bring to the doorstep of Khomeini in the last chapter of my book. So he is correct that not just I, both he, when he looks at Fardid, the same way, we are looking for something despite the alterities that existed in their critical apparatus. And by teasing those things out, I from Al-Ahmad, Ali from Fardid, we are mapping out the contours of a different intellectual posterity or futurity, as Atif just quoted me, that cannot be wayward, cannot be wishful thinking, cannot be, oh, are you westernized or are you traditional or are you modern? Has to be rooted in the lived experiences of nations and their enduring memorial consciousness. Eleni gave my book precisely the kind of reading that I was hoping when I invited her to join our conversation. Not just on the question of the relationship between Ethiopia and Iran and the reference to Shah and Haile Selassie. We all remember of my childhood, I mean, teenage years, Haile Selassie coming to Iran for the 2,500-year anniversary of Persian monarchy. But more in her estimation, the question of how are we not to be either nostalgic or reactionary in that nostalgia towards people like Al-Ahmad or any number of African thinkers, critical thinkers of that generation. My response to that, Eleni, is the way I locate the period and episteme of Al-Ahmad's writing as a particular epistemic moment that has exhausted itself. So first we have to historicize it, then we have to place it in a particular social political context, and then we have to understand that this was not sort of a teleology of history that came to that end and then finish is done, how unfortunate, how terrible. But look at it as an episteme. And since it is an episteme that had a beginning and had an end, then we can begin to see what is the particular epistemic formation of our own time, our own generation, whether it's consider the example that you give, that usually Ethiopian revolution or Iranian revolution or Egyptian revolution are not put within the sort of trajectory of revolution, as in fact Haitian revolution was not put, whereas it was far more successful in many enduring ways than both French and American revolution. It is just not part of the map. And bringing Haitian revolution or Ethiopian revolution, it is not as addendum to sort of a trajectory from French to American revolutions, but as crafting alternatives of how to think of social mobilization, how to think of political maneuvering, how to think of not just, as Scott rightly says, sort of post-colonial condition as not as romance, but as tragedy, but as a different kind of epic reimagining of a world that has been other, that has been systematically excluded. So if we look at it as a particular epistemic moment, then you can consider my exercise as an exercise in analytical, theoretical sublimation of that episteme, not dwelling on that episteme, but sublimating, aufgehoben, a kind of a Hegelian aufgehoben, that now we move forward into a different reading of Adornian negative dialectic that makes it possible for us to and that will not happen until you place Al-Ahmad next to Senghor, place Al-Ahmad next to Du Bois, wonderful quote that Ati just made, place him next to Aimé Césaire, as he was, both physically, intellectually, etc. But at the same time, try to see how to transcend them. First, the episteme has to be mapped out. Second, episteme should not be made into a nostalgia. Third, from that critical reading the episteme, how do we move forward? There's much more to be said, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in different contexts. As for, now you have made me conscious of Aghay Dabashi and Khanem Akbari. She is such a clever reader, such an amazing literary reader, because she just put her point on my kind of Oedipal relationship with Al-Ahmad. What the passage that she didn't quote, but is right there when she cited, is where I say that, like all other sons, I grew up thinking Al-Ahmad was the greatest gift to humanity. And eventually I realized, oh, what a dumb idiot was Al-Ahmad. And then I realized, well, he's just a regular man like everybody else. This Oedipal moment, or Sohrabane as we call it, Oedipal is Greek. In Iranian epic context, we call it Sohrabane, from Sohrab, is the key moment in relationship between English and Persian that Atefa very well articulated. What I haven't told him, the master of Persian fiction, Mahmoud Dolatabadi, dear friend, once told me, why do you keep writing in English? Why don't you write in Persian? Well, I used to write in Persian, but I don't anymore. I said, because of your damn shadow over me. I couldn't breathe with all of you looking over my shoulder. Whatever goddamn sentence I said, I thought you were looking at me, judging me, and I was so I run away to English language. Now you can't read me. You have to go and find out what it is that I'm saying. This liberating movement from Persian into English that has created all kinds of reflections on my prose. Some say Hamid writes English in Persian. Others say, which I love, say Hamid is the only Palestinian with a remarkable knowledge of Iran. These are all, amazing paradoxical facts of our lived experiences. But the way that Atefe turns it into the literary disposition of the original work of Al Ahmad, which also my colleague Nasrin Rahimiya detected when she kindly blurbed the book, points to the intersection, not just my own disciplines as a critical thinker and a literary theorist and all of that, but the fact of Al Ahmad's writing. That is, I'm not inventing this. I'm just going into Al Ahmad's writing and looking at words such as Safar and Hazar that Atir correctly detected, link it to Heimlich und Unheimlich. But from that encounter, I begin to come out in a way that would enable that encounter to pave the way. So that exercise itself, going back to Eleanor's point, that exercise itself is a liberation from a closed episteme that had exhausted itself and is now making it possible. Namely, without Ali, Mirsapasi, Atefe Akbari, and me having come from the Iranian context and living in a place like New York, on a campus like Columbia, with our colleagues being who our colleagues are, and continued systematic generative conversation with our colleagues, this prose would not have been possible. This is a very specific prose that has been enabled. And I recently finished reading Eleanor's magnificent work, which I deeply admire. And her book and her way of thinking is already beginning to infiltrate into my writing. The same is when I was reading Atefe's doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, I cite and celebrate to the moon. And most recently, Ali's autobiography, which is going to be a bombshell when it comes out, hopefully soon. So there's a lot to be said, but I don't want to blabber away. 7:23. I'm going to stop right here, Gil, and whatever it is that you wish to do.
All right, thank you so much. So before we will move to the Q&A, I will take advantage of my position to just maybe ask Hamid to address one thing that I was, well, two things actually really crossed my mind when I was read. Of course, the last Muslim intellectual is, one cannot read the title without reading the last Jewish intellectual, Said's title. And so I did want to ask you if you could say a word about that, not necessarily about Said, but about the kind of position, worldliness position that you are articulating here, which I think maybe some, that there was, I feel sort of kind of a period where perhaps there was some kind of a, there was the moment of cosmopolitanism followed by a moment of let's not do that, and rejecting that. And then I do see, when I read this, I saw a lot in common with how I at least read Said's almost persistent insistence on a kind of worldliness that is, not that, I don't know what term to call, clean, nativist, pure, etc., that I believe that you're also suggesting. And in a way, for me, the way in which you brought together Islamism and Zionism and the legacy from Edward Said to this is, so profound as a project, and as a project that reminds us what the world wants to forget, which is that we still are living in a world that is designed by European colonialism, that it is the design of the world as we know it now. So if you could say a few words about that, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. First of all, I just was reminded of your own work on Said's very provocative and very true, in an enduring way, true statement that he was the last Jewish intellectual. And in my book, actually, I refer to Russell Jacoby's book, The Last Intellectuals, as a moment that two critical factors in the construction of American intellectual history. One is the East European, German in particular, Jewish intellectuals who came here in the aftermaths of Nazism, the generation of Adorno and Arendt and so forth. And they become the defining moment of what it means to be a public intellectual. And Edward, in his representation of intellectuals, you remember, he deeply identifies with Adorno, not just because of their mutual love for music, but precisely because of that sense of not being here, but being here. But what both Adorno and Said disregard, but it's very important for me, which is contemporaneous with the Jewish intellectual migration into US, is the Harlem Renaissance. For me, Harlem Renaissance is equally important in understanding the intellectual configuration. And I begin to talk about that in the book. But the central idea of worldliness, Gil, that you just mentioned, is I take it from both sides in the idea of worldliness, but also from Gadamer, of being in the world and worldliness. He takes it from Heidegger, but I have nothing to do with Heidegger. Gadamer is sufficient for me. Between Gadamer and Said, and nor do I go in the direction of secularism that Said takes it. As I repeatedly say, you know, some of my best friends are secular, but I don't know what to do with the word. The word has no meaning, al-mani in Arabic or secular in Persian. You know, we don't know what to do with this word. There is much more that needs to be done here. And here, I think Gil and Najjar, our colleagues, just extraordinary essay on secularism is a key factor. So minus that question of secularity, for me, worldliness is not just being in the world now, but retrieving the worlds that have existed, but have been camouflaged. Again, going back to the point that Eleni was making, that Ethiopian revolution or Iranian revolution or Haitian revolution were not just happening in a vacuum. They were happening within a historical consciousness. And locating the worldliness of that consciousness is not just the contemporary, but also the lost worlds or reminiscences or debris, as the great magnificent Benjamin called it, the relics, the debris that become allegorical in our retrieving of the lost worlds. So those are the elements. Thank you for that wonderful question, Miguel.
Thank you. I will look at the Q&A. And I'm going to present the questions here. I might do a brief of it because they're rather long, but the first question is, I'll read it. My question is that the likes of Al-Ahmad were figures who showed the way of the intellectuals to generations that linked social analysis to philosophy, literature, mysticism, sociology, and so on. A generation that was a golden generation. And each promoted the kind of analytical view. People like Sadeh Hedayat paid more attention to popular culture, but Jalal Al-e had a deeper connection to politics. Did he find a safe haven from the rest of his generation to be different? And how scalable are these kinds of works? And will they have a practical application in our time? There are a few more questions here, but maybe I'll let Professor Hamid answer this before I read more questions in this question.
It's a very wonderful and rich and multifaceted question. The only thing is I have no sense of nostalgia. There's nothing wrong with nostalgia. As Umberto Eco said, even nostalgia, old-fashioned nostalgia. golden generation. That is not a golden generation. He was a restless man. And one of the key chapters in the book is the chapter of this dialogical relationship that he has with his wife. So his wife is this, also he for her and she for him. This is the space within which they think, and they work together, they translate together, they travel together. And there was a nasty moment that he had an extramarital affair, which I detail in the book because it has been documented. And their correspondences during that time shows the precise moment and a space, going to the question that this friend has put forward, this space within which Al-Ahmad found his sanity. That is, he was obsessively writing to almost 3 times as much as she was writing to him, he was writing to her. That is space of writing. It was the location where all of these aspects, his mysticism, his sociology, his anthropology, both doing anthropology and being critical of anthropology, come together.
Thank you. Actually, the end of this question, it's interesting because I read, is this a historical autopsy or will it pave the way for the future? I'm wondering, Hamid, because I was wondering when I read this, it's so interesting, it's so rare to find in an academic book suddenly this account of the personal relationship between him and his partner, his wife. And I do wonder if it affects this particular question about the historical autopsy or a relation to a future, because it does do something even to your structure of the book, right? If you want to take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why somebody would look at it as an autopsy, but no, for me, Al-Ahmad is a living organism, and I treat him as a living organism. So it is a roadmap, as I was just saying to Eleni. It is not so much a roadmap, but it's kind of a coming together to realize what happened, sort of rescuing him, as Ali Mirza Pasi rightly said, rescuing him both from his admirers, because in Iran highways are named after him and stamps are issued for him, and it is a testimony to Atifeh's critical intelligence, that despite the fact that she has been a victim of that kind of a state propaganda abusing Al-Ahmad, that she has survived and come to her own critical consciousness of this. That it is crucial not to turn him into a model, but turn him into somebody, as a case study that has encapsulated an age, and coming to terms with that age is a prerequisite of our being in our own age. Going back to your own point about worldliness, for us to be in our own world the way that he was in his own world.
Thank you. And another question that is specifically about context. The question here is about the book being written in English. And the question is, given that the book is written in English to English-speaking audience, the question is whether Dr. Dabashi thinks that it would have the same message or relevance in contemporary Iran, and to what degree can this message be or not different in the social Iranian context and setting that is still dealing with some troublesome consequences of anti-imperialism?
Very, very good point. You see, the thing is, I no longer think that Iran or Iranians are limited inside Iran. Ali Mirza Pasi, Atifeh and I are Iranians, but we are not living in Iran. There is a very significant component of Iranians who live abroad. My hope is that, yes, I mean, I'm persona non grata in Iran. None of my books have been translated. I mean, they are translated, but permission is not given for them to be published. So I'm more published in Turkey and in Arabic and Japanese and such than I am into Persian. I hope, the question is very pertinent, that the book will be available in Persian for Iranians, because it's an entirely antidote to what the state has made of Al-Ahmad. And also, as Atifeh rightly said, what opposition has made of Al-Ahmad. It is neither here nor there. It is possible through a critical reading of this text.
Thank you. A question from our dear colleague, Joseph Massad. The claim, as the claim put forth suggests that Muslim and Jewish intellectuals have disappeared, does it mean that the world of Islam and Judaism is now fully taken over by Christian intellectuals who are so abundant and dominating? Are Muslims and Jews doomed to just replicate Christian intellectualism?
As all other questions that Joseph asks, the answer, of course, in it, no, it is not. And nor do I claim, if in fact, if anything, as the passage that Gil just quoted shows, that in fact I'm retrieving the possibilities of epistemic overcoming of both Islamism and Zionism. It is actively imagining a post-Islamist and post-Zionist world in which the idea of Jewish intellectual, beyond what Said had said as the last Muslim intellectual, what Gil, you don't know, and I think Joseph doesn't know either. I recently wrote that if Said was the last Jewish intellectual, he made it possible for me to be the first New York Muslim intellectuals, namely reclaiming my position. So Joseph's question answers itself, of course not, but to the degree that, and also it depends on what kind of Christianity. If we're talking about Latin American liberation theology, that people like Gustavo Gutierrez and others have articulated, that's a different Christianity than we have of North American Christianity.
Thank you. A question now for both Professor Dabashi and Akbari. Do you see Al-Ahmad's joining of an eventual frustration with Iran's communist movement? Do you see it comparable to the Négritude movement and the interactions of its key figures, such as Césaire or Senghor, with the French Communist Party and the USSR?
Ati, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I can't speak to the second part of the question in terms of their interactions with the French Communist Party and the USSR. I do know, though, that from a intellectual history standpoint, Vijay Prashad, in his chapter titled Tehran and the book The Darker Nations, he does make a connection between the work that Césaire and Fanon are doing and Al-Ahmad Qarbzadegi, and then Negin Nabavi in a book, I think it's called Intellectuals and the State in Iran, if I'm not mistaken. She talks about periodicals that in Iran in the 1960s that contain translations of Aimé Césaire, among others. And she sort of talks of this third world intellectual idea, or the third worldist intellectual, the Iranian intellectual, the third worldist intellectual, sort of drawing like I said, an intellectual history between the two. But I can't really comment on their political activities because I don't know well enough about that.
I think Arash's question is very, very legitimate. There are structural differences, as I'm sure Arash knows himself. The frustration of Al-Ahmad with the Tudeh party had to do with Al-Ahmad's critical stance vis-a-vis Soviet Union, and also his defiant and flamboyant character. He was not a disciplinarian. He could not be part of a political party. And so the affinity or affiliation of Al-Ahmad with Tudeh party is slightly different from the Francophonie condition of Césaire and the whole Négritude movement. But nevertheless, what he, Arash, is rightly detecting is a kind of critical consciousness that comes from the experience of colonialism that neither the Soviet socialism nor French communism reacted to. In fact, in the piece The second part of his travelogue to Israel, which was written and published after the 1967 war, he begins with a severe critique of French intellectuals, Al-Ahmad. So there are structural similarities, but there is a limit to that similarity. Al-Ahmad was not as deeply rooted in the Soviet socialism as the Negritude movement was within and Césaire and Senghor in French Communist Party. But their frustration and disillusionment was not just disillusionment with the French Communist Party, but with the critical consciousness of their own whereabout, which becomes the fertile ground for the Negritude movement.
Thank you so much, Hamid, and thank you all. I believe these are the questions that I have available. I do want to mention before we depart that the book is available for the book that we have discussed today, and that I strongly recommend reading. It's available from Edinburgh University Press, and if you use the code EVENT30, you will get a 30% off, which is also in the chat. I believe it's in the chat, and if not, it will be circulated in the chat. Once again, I want to thank those of you. Yes?
If I may say something about the book is just come out in the paper, in the hardcover is very expensive. And as you kindly said, yes, the publisher is giving substantial discount, but I just heard from them that they have selected this book for their digital library, so will soon be available via internet officially from the Edinburgh University Press, so that they can get it. And hopefully within a year, the paperback will come. Those of us like me and Eleni, who are, we like books, physical books.
Yes, that's probably the majority of us here on the screen, and the other crazy 60 people who are spending the evening with us. This was really a delight. I thank you so much. Wonderful to hear all of you. I personally learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. And happy Ramadan for those of you who are celebrating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gil, Alijan, Ati, Eleni. Thank you very much for coming. This was beautiful.
Thank you, Hamid. Thank you, everyone. This was
absolutely beautiful.